Erev Tov, everyone. It is, for a change, it is Tuesday night. It is 8 p.m. here on the east side of the United States, here in the diaspora. This is the Maimon Beit Knesset, and this is our new show. The Rabbis Discuss whatever it is that we want to discuss with yours truly, Rabbi A, Rabbi Ancel. And let me bring Rabbi Ancel in, and let me
I am here.
okay, bring Rabbi Ancel in, and just a minute, let me fix something here, and let me
I am here.
okay, bring Rabbi Ancel in, and okay, I have my volume on the on the monitor. So anyway, can you hear me?
I can hear you. And hello, everyone. Shalom. Welcome back. It's been a little while, but we're healthy and we are going to continue our shows every Tuesday night.
Okay, so first of all, let's see. I want to make sure that everybody is able to hear you, and just make sure that I've got my settings correct. So if you can hear Rabbi Ansel in the chat room, let me know so I know that I've got. Oh, Donald says yes. Okay, so let's see who we got in the chat room. We have Donald, we have Marshall, we have Yair, and we have others who are watching in the background, probably on their tablets or phone, and they can't actually get into the chat room. So the rabbis discuss. Okay, so let's. The first thing I want to do is we're discussing modern day cases based on halachic law. So what I want to do is I want to first of all I want to pose the question we're going to be discussing this evening, and then give you a chance in the chat room to actually give us what you think the answer would be, and then we're going to go through the Beit Din's explanation and discuss that. So let me start out by posing the question, and as you know, when I put it up in the announcements, that we called it "Would you like a little wine with that?" So, and the question happens to be. Borrowed a very expensive wine by mistake. The question goes, recently when I forgot to buy grape juice for Shabbat, I went to a neighbor and asked to borrow a bottle of grape juice. My neighbor replied that he didn't have any grape juice, but he could lend me a bottle of wine. I told him that I don't really like wine, but since there was no alternative, I would take the bottle of wine. We made up that I would return to him the same wine after Shabbat. When I went to the store to buy an identical bottle of wine, I was shocked to discover that the bottle I borrowed cost $200. I would never have borrowed such an expensive wine, especially since I really don't like any wine. On Friday night, I could have made kiddush with on challah, and for the day I could have found another solution. Am I obligated to return such expensive wine? So that's the question. So before we go into that, before we get into what the Beit Din said, and just so everybody knows, okay, so I want to show you where I get this from. I get one of these every single week because I am just that much of a nerd that I love to read these things. I love to see what they are. Okay, so in the chat room, Richard has joined us, and Simcha has joined us, and Donald says only 200. Okay, so anyway, before we get into that, I'm going to give you a chance to actually put what you think the answer is in the chat room. And while you're doing that, I want to say that this summer I had a fantastic experience with Rabbi Ancel where we were getting together 2-3 times a week, actually, to go through halakhic law related to modern day events. And I have to say, it's one of the best summers I've actually spent studying. It was a great pleasure. Are you still with us?
My pleasure is the same. It is something that most people should read, should listen to what we discuss, because it is today's life in laws that were made 3,000 years ago or more. But yet they still are the laws of today, relating to today. But you will see in this evening's discussion that somewhere, somehow, they do change with time, but halachically, Jewish law does not.
Yeah, they hold up.
They hold up.
They hold up. And just before, I want to mention this, that you'll see in the background here that we have a backdrop now that was provided to us by Marshall Reese, who got us this beautiful background, which is the kind of an elevated view of the Kotel. It's actually very nice. Those of you who are here for Zeta Story Corner saw it on Zeta Story Corner, and we're going to be using it because it is actually quite beautiful. But anyway, getting back to what we were talking about, it was a great experience, because I think, how this all started. We actually decided to study the laws. And the first thing we did was we went to, what was it, Bava Batra, right?
Yes.
Yeah, we started out with Bava Batra, and we started reading through it. And we were kind of struggling with it, and, kind of getting through it, and
it's not an easy study.
No, it is not. And we kind of got off track, and we were talking about Rabbi Auerbach. We got talking about Rabbi Auerbach, and I started researching Rabbi Auerbach and stuff like that, and looking at some of his writings and stuff like that. And I found a connection to an article that talked about the difference between the ways that students studied Talmud and halakhic law from the Glitzianers and the Litvish methods of studying the law. And one of the things that actually struck me was that it was the Litvish, right?
Yeah.
The Litvish actually looked at case law. They actually studied case law, whereas the Glitzianers actually delved strictly in the Torah and the halakha of the Torah, the Mishnah, and looking strictly at that, where the Litvish were actually going into actual case law and looking at it and say, well, here's a reference here, let's see what the reference says and stuff like that. So Ancel and I started talking about it, and we said, that's probably a much better way to study this so that we actually get a much better grasp, because that's actually how they studied law in the United States, in Europe, and Canada and stuff, in university. When somebody is learning to, is going into the law profession, that's how they learn. They learn by studying case law.
To me, that is the only way that you should learn law, because every case is different. And by listening to some of these people that talk in front of the Supreme Court of the United States or Canada, that's all they do is this case law and this case law and this case law. And these people on the Supreme Court, they must know these cases by heart. And the only way you learn those cases is to go through them. The Galicianos say, oh, well, they read it and it doesn't work that way, because you will see in tonight's discussions, I don't know how many people are in the chat room, everybody's going to have a different answer.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you're right, and it doesn't mean you're wrong, but there will be differences in answer. And after Rabbi Aryel reads the article and we see the conclusion, we are both of the understanding that we both disagree with the conclusion, and then we will go through why. But at the same time, that doesn't make us right and that doesn't make us wrong. But that's the way case studies are done. And
yeah, as we know, there is always a dissenting opinion.
Yeah, but it doesn't. The dissenting opinion could be some people in the Supreme Courts. Some dissented. They agreed, 4 agreed, and 3 disagreed.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll always have somebody who has a different opinion. And like I said, whether the opinion is right or wrong, that is for you to decide. But the interesting part is, halacha still doesn't change. Still stays the same.
That's right. Okay. So let's see what we got in the chat room. Let's see. Donald says, yes, you have to give back the same wine.
Why?
Yair says you have to give back the same wine. And he goes on to say that because you already made the agreement. And Marshall says, give back the same wine unless the neighbor would accept 200 bottles of Magen David. Okay.
That's not bad.
People put down Magen David a lot. And I tell you what, I like it. Call me low class. I like this stuff. I like Manischewitz too. So I'm not a wine snob. Okay, so let's go in.
Okay.
Yeah, let's go into what the din had to say on this. So, just again, for those who are just joining us, I'll read the question once again. Recently, I forgot to buy grape juice for Shabbat. I went to my neighbor and asked to borrow a bottle of grape juice. My neighbor replied he did not have any grape juice, but he could lend me a bottle of wine. I told him that I really don't like wine, but since there was no alternative, I would take the bottle of wine. We made up that I would return to him the same wine after Shabbat. When I went to the store to buy an identical bottle of wine, I was shocked to discover that the bottle I borrowed cost $200. I would never have bought such expensive wine, especially since I really don't like any wine. On Friday night, I could have made kiddush on challah, and for the day, I could have found another solution. Am I obligated to return such expensive wine? Okay, so Simcha has actually put something in the chat room. It says his neighbor stressed at the time that he wanted the same wine returned, and this was an implied condition of the exchange. Thus, by accepting the wine, this person is committed to fulfill the agreement. That doesn't matter that the borrower neglected to find out the amount of the wine. Therefore, it is civilly good form to purchase the named wine. Again, from Simcha. Okay, so let's see what the din has to say. Okay, put a lot of thought into that one.
Yep.
Okay, so the first step, as always, is to understand what happened from a halachic perspective. Since your agreement was to return the exact type of bottle in place of the bottle you received, what you did was to borrow a bottle of wine. In Hebrew, there are two separate words. One, lovo, which means borrow something with the understanding that something equivalent will be returned, but not the original object. This is generally the case when borrowing money or other shoal, meaning to borrow something that with the expectation that the original object itself be returned, such as when borrowing someone's car or a tool of his, or so on and so forth. In this case, you borrowed the wine in the first sense, since your expectation was that you would return an equivalent bottle of wine, but not the original one. Okay? This would generally be the case when borrowing something consumable, such as food. We find in the Gemara that the concept of borrowing is not confined to money, but extends to objects as well. For example, the Gemara Bava Metzia, folio 61a, discusses borrowing food in the context of ribbit. Thus, you did what you did were two actions. First, you borrowed a bottle of wine, and second, you drank it. Both of these actions were done by mistake, since, one, you would not have borrowed such expensive wine on purpose, and two, had you discovered after borrowing it that it was so expensive, you would not have drunk it. Therefore, we will study the legal ramifications of each of these actions as performed based on a false impression. Any comments so far? Ancel?
Okay, here is my question. You are my neighbor, so you definitely know me and I know you.
Mm-hmm.
You also know my standing, or am I well-to-do or am I not well-to-do? Also, you should know, I should know about you. So, where is the onus? Should you have told me that that bottle is an expensive bottle of wine? And I should have asked if that bottle of wine is an expensive bottle of wine. So it goes both ways.
That's true. I mean, due diligence, let's face it. If my neighbor drives around in a Rolls Royce, I should expect that what he has is going to be, he has expensive taste.
Correct.
And he's going to probably buy things that are more expensive. Now, me as the neighbor with the Rolls Royce, I should be so lucky, see my neighbor who is driving a 12-year-old Chevrolet, and I should understand that I should immediately know, that he is probably somebody that would not be spending a tremendous amount of money on wine. So again, to your point, it's, it seems to be we have a negligence on both people's parts.
Correct. But as you as my neighbor, knowing my position, wouldn't have been the onus to tell me, hey, listen, here's a bottle of wine, but by the way, that bottle of wine is $200. I wouldn't have drank that bottle.
True, but then again, you can go the other way too and say that, well, if I'm borrowing from my neighbor and everything he has is top of the line and everything, and I ask him to borrow some wine, wouldn't I be responsible to say, as a borrower, to say, how much is this bottle of wine?
Correct. So the onus holds on both sides.
That's true, and I think we'll find out even more. We can discuss this even more as we get into this and finding out what the rabbis had to say on this.
Okay.
So let's go on. So This is actually quite lengthy because it was actually in two parts. Donald says, "What about those who drive a Yugo, dude? If you're still driving a Yugo today, you have got one good Yugo because those things did not last much longer than the warranty on them, such as they
Correct.
were." Yeah, it was. Yeah, I actually knew a guy who basically lost his business because he was building Yugos here in the United States, and when they went under, he was stuck. Anyway, let's get on with what the rabbi said. When one purchases something based on a false impression of what it is, we classify the sale as mechak to'us, and the sale is invalid. Okay, a false impression of what it is. Okay, well, we know that it's wine. Okay, an example that is discussed in Gemara Bava Batra, folio 92a, concerns a person who purchased an ox in order to plow with it, but who received an uncontrollable ox that was only suitable for slaughtering. The Gemara rules that if it was clear at the time of the sale that the customer's intention was to use the ox for plowing, the sale is invalid and the customer is entitled to a full refund of his money. Well, in this case, I can understand that. But in the case where he borrowed the wine, he intended to borrow the wine in order to drink it, which is what he actually did.
Hold it.
Yes.
But isn't the onus of the guy who's selling him the ox to say, "Oh, by the way, this guy is uncontrollable. He's no good for plowing." Is he obligated? This is where the question comes in. Is he obligated?
Yeah.
To tell you, by the way. So
well, yeah, and
continue.
then it goes on to even beyond that is that if I don't tell the seller what my intention is, am I actually entitled? If I say I want to buy this ox, I don't say I want to buy this ox for plowing or something like that. And
you're out of luck.
Yeah, the guy just saying things. Oh, the guy must want to slaughter it, so yeah, I'll sell it to him, no problem. So anyway, it goes on to say, the rationale is that in order for a sale to be valid, it is not enough just to perform actions such as an act of kinyan. Both parties have to want it to take place. When one acts in error, there is a lack of consent or desire for the transaction to take place, and this makes the transaction invalid. Okay, so in the case of the ox, I can understand this fully. I wanted to buy the ox to plow with, and it was just suitable for slaughtering. So, for example, in the case of the ox, a kinyan was performed on an ox that was only fit for slaughtering. But since the buyer wanted an ox to plow with, he did not really want to acquire the ox which he performed his act of kinyan. Since the buyer did not really want the transaction to take place, therefore his kinyan was invalid. And again, it's not going into saying whether there was actually any exchange of what the ox was. Did one mislead the other, which would have invalidated it anyway, right?
Yes, but it didn't say that he paid for it.
No, it doesn't say that. It just said that they had a kinyan, which is just basically the agreement.
A kinyan is an agreement.
Yeah.
Kinyan is not a transaction.
That's right. It's a kind of like a deposit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you can translate kinyan in so many different ways and still come out to the same answer.
Yeah.
What was the transaction valid or was it invalid?
Right. Similarly, it would seem the same should be true when the interaction between two parties is not a sale but a loan of the first kind. Thus, if the loan of the first kind took place based on an error, then the loan is not valid and the object which was borrowed in reality legally remains in the possession of the lender. The reason is because that one borrows an object in this way, he is legally acquiring this specific object. However, instead of having to pay money for it as in a sale, he has to pay back the same type of object. In your situation, the borrower did not intend to borrow or to drink such expensive wine. And again, this is where I have an issue with this. He did borrow with the intent of drinking wine.
It doesn't matter whether he likes wine or he doesn't like wine. He drank the wine. He must have liked it because it was a good bottle of wine.
Yeah. But I mean, it's not like he borrowed, it's not like he got a bottle of wine and when he opened it, it had turned to vinegar. Right? In that case, the sale would have been void because it was not what he bought it with the intention of. He bought it with the intention of drinking it, and when he opens it, he finds that it's turned to vinegar. It has oxidized and turned to vinegar, and therefore it's not suitable for the use that he actually borrowed it for.
So that bottle of wine belongs to the owner.
Belongs to the owner, right? Okay. So therefore, if the concept of makach tu'ut extends to loans as well, from a legal point of view, the wine remains in the possession of your neighbor and you actually drank his wine. Okay, I just want to catch up in the chat room. See, here says that it would be different if he replaced with another bottle of. It depends. If it was of equal value, he can actually do that. According to halacha, he can actually do that, right?
Here's the problem.
Yes.
The price of the wine was not specified.
True.
The owner of the wine, he didn't say anything to him. So am I obligated to replace the same? Here's the thing, here's the word. Am I obligated to replace the same bottle of wine?
Right.
There was no value of discussion in the transaction.
Yeah. But there was an agreement that he would replace it with the same thing.
It's an agreement, a contract. It's a discussion or a word.
It's not a contract unless there's a kinyan, right?
Correct. So it's just a discussion between two people, between me and you, my neighbor. This is what we discussed. An agreement, is it a legal or valid contract?
Yeah, no, it's not actually a contract. That's why the halakha makes such a distinction between a purchase and a borrow.
Correct.
Okay, so let's see what else the Beit Din has to say. Okay, in fact, we find evidence that the concept of makach tu'ot does apply to loans as well. The Mishnah, Lamelech, Malveh 8:1, and it's and his contention is supported by the Machaneh Ephraim Ribbit 37 and Chavot Da'at. Now you can see why this stuff is so interesting. This is like the lawyers talking about in such and such a case this, such and such a case that, and going on and on. When they're citing precedent, that's exactly what's going on here. That the Beit Din is actually citing precedent here. Okay, so provides that if a person lent money with interest because the two parties thought that taking interest was allowed, and later the borrower realized that he is not allowed to pay interest and thus will refuse to pay interest, the lender may demand the immediate return of his money, since he can argue that he only extended the loan in order to receive interest. When one
Hold it.
Yeah.
Hold it.
Uh-huh.
Hold it. Okay, now we're dealing between Jews, correct? So halachically, not allowed to charge interest.
Exactly.
So he can demand his money back. That's not right. He can't.
Okay. Well, we would have to actually go into the references to find out what the whole story is. Now, let's say they were both ger toshav, and they didn't actually realize that they couldn't charge interest. We don't know. That's the thing. We don't know what the extenuating circumstances are.
Yeah, but you see, this is why you need to see the whole case, because I'm assuming and you're assuming, but we could be both wrong.
That's right.
We don't have the details of what the transaction went through between the two of them. Was there an agreement that, okay, I'll lend you $100, but you'll return me $110, which is $10 worth of interest, or wasn't there?
Right. So if we go on here,
a person who lends money, he is a lender. He should know the law.
Yes. So let's go.
So,
when one extends a loan, he is normally unable to demand repayment before the end of the term of the contract, because he committed himself at the time the loan was granted, to allow the borrower to use the money until the end of the term. However, since in this case his commitment was made based on incorrect information, the commitment is makach tuot, and thus invalid. Okay, so let's take an example. Okay, so I loan money out. I loan out money to Jews, and I loan out money to goyim. Okay, I'm allowed to take interest from goyim, correct?
You are.
Okay, so a guy comes to me and he's ger toshav. Okay, he's got a very goyish name. He's got a very goyish kop, right?
Yep.
And I just assume that he's goy, and I make the loan, and I say with interest. Okay, so the ger toshav leader, after the loan is given, decides that, or finds out that he's not allowed to pay interest.
But here's the mistake that you said. You assumed.
Yes,
You can't assume.
that's true.
You assumed that he was a ger toshav, but maybe he wasn't. So you cannot assume on anything. Halacha does not doesn't look good. I don't know how to say it. Halacha just does not agree with somebody who says, well, I assume this, I assume that.
Right.
It's either. So by the lender assuming that he was a ger toshav, he was wrong. So the transaction would be invalid. He cannot charge him interest.
Right. Okay.
If he knew exactly who he was, yes, then I can agree. But making an assumption, you're wrong. It could go both ways.
Right, and we find that a lot of times.
Correct.
That the rabbis will say, and we've seen it. This rabbi and this rabbi say this, and this rabbi and that rabbi say, no, you're wrong. It's this. And again, that's the thing about the Talmud, is that very rarely do we come to a final conclusion. There's always a dissenting opinion.
Yeah, they'll come to a conclusion, right or wrong, but you'll never see in halacha or anywhere say, well, in this conclusion we assume, because as soon as you say that, it's gone, it's finished. You cannot assume.
Right.
You either say, it's like a dissenting opinion from the Supreme Court. They will quote for where they got all the answers.
Yeah.
Some will agree with it, some will disagree with it. But once he puts that thing out and says, this is my opinion, does it make him right or wrong?
His opinion?
Yeah.
Well, opinion is opinion. Assumption is something completely different.
I'm the one who's making the dissent, and this is what I say. I believe that this is what the law is.
Yeah, but do you have supporting documentation to go with it?
Correct, but you will still have people who have a different opinion.
Yeah,
so
and I mean, that's one of the things that we first learned when we learned, Talmud. What is the proof? It's the question that comes up constantly. Well, I say this. Well, what is your proof? What's your proof text? Okay, so I want to say, let's catch up with the chat room. It says, if I borrow your Ford F-350 and wreck it, number one, I would never have a Ford. So there you go. Answer the question right then and there. No, actually, yes. And I wreck it. Can I replace it with a Ford F-150? Both are Ford pickups. No, because they're not actually the same thing. An F-350 is F-350 is a 1-ton pickup, and you're going to replace it with a half-ton pickup, which is half of the value. Okay, it has to be of equivalent value. Now, if you gave them two F-150s, or if you borrowed my 1990 Ford F-350 and you wreck it and you want to replace it with a newer F-150, then that may be all right, as long as I accept it. Right? I have to be able to accept the exchange.
Here's my question, though.
Mm-hmm.
I come to you and I borrow your F-150 and I wreck it. Okay?
Yeah.
But I can't afford to replace it.
That goes into another case law that we have in my library.
I can only replace you with a whatever, a Toyota, whatever. That's all I can afford. What is the halacha?
Well, let's hold that, and we'll discuss that next week. I'll pull up the case law for next week, and we'll discuss that one.
Okay.
So let's go on here. So similarly, since your commitment to repay was based on incorrect information, you never legally borrowed the wine that you received. Rather, the wine remains the wine of your neighbor, and thus, in legal terms, what happened was that you mistakenly drank your neighbor's wine. Having established that there was no loan, we have to consider the issue of payment for the wine. As we noted, in the legal description of what you did was to drink your neighbor's wine in error. This is exactly the same situation as when a sale was invalid due to a mistake. The classical case of makak ta'ut, since both cases, and this really actually gets interesting. Since both cases, something is sitting by a person who mistakenly thinks that it's his. The fact is that in one case, what caused it to come into the hands of the recipient was an invalid sale, and in another case, it was an invalid loan having no bearing on the law. The case where an object came into the hands of a recipient because of a mistake and invalid sale is discussed in Shulchan Aruch, CM 232:21. The case is that someone bought seeds to plant and the seeds failed to sprout. Since the seeds were bought to plant and not to eat, the sale was invalid and the customer is entitled to a full refund of the money he paid to acquire the seeds. Even though he does not return the seeds to the seller, he is still entitled to a refund, and we don't say that the customer has to pay for the seeds that he damaged by trying to plant them. The reason is because his behavior was normal for one who purchases seeds to plant. So, and it goes on to reference Ritvo Baba.
So did he buy the
92.8.
seeds to be planted?
Go ahead.
Did he buy this? My question is, were the seeds bought with the intention to be planted?
According what it says here, yes, they were bought with the intention of planting.
And he planted them.
And he planted them.
But they didn't grow.
Right.
Whose fault? The seller didn't know whether they're going to grow. The purchaser didn't know whether they were going to grow. Blame the ground? Don't know. But this is a dilemma because the transaction, to me, is correct. Who's to be blamed that the seeds didn't grow?
Well, and one of the things we can get a hint from what it says that he bought the seeds with the intention of planting them, not to eat them. Okay, so.
But here's the other question: what was the seller's intention to sell these seeds? Were they seeds to be planted, or were they to be eaten?
Or was it a mistake? Was the seeds that the seller sold that he thought were seeds to be planted were actually mislabeled, and they were seeds that were intended to be eaten?
He could have had 2 bags, and the seeds were mislabeled. Yeah, so you can start looking at different things that happen during the transaction. Who are you going to blame? Because it's easy to say, well, the transaction is invalid, but there are so many things involved in this transaction that you need to sit down and go through the whole case.
Exactly.
Like I said,
that's why the law, and even in the Torah, says that a judge has to thoroughly investigate a case.
And he has to give you from where he got the answers, how he got the answer, and does it make sense? Because you're looking at you have somebody brought you in 2 bags of seeds. The guy who brought the seeds may have mislabeled the seeds when he put the tags on the thing. Mm-hmm. So you saw that these seeds are for planting. You sold me these seeds to be planted, but they were the wrong seeds. It's not my fault, and it's not your fault.
Right.
But the question is, does it make the transaction invalid? Because I had the right intention, and so did you.
Yeah.
But there was an outside mistake, and this is another thing that we have to look at. Third party.
Right. Yeah, I was just going to say that. So if if I sold you seeds and they didn't sprout, and we find out that they were the wrong seeds, you come back to me to get a refund for it, and I find out that whoever sold me the seeds had mislabeled them. It seems like
So it's the
halachically
third party's mistake.
I would have to repay you. I would have to pay you the money back, and then I would have to go back to the person who sold me the seeds and go after him for the money that I spent on the seeds.
Ex- Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so we're at our halfway point. We're going to take a 6-minute break here. Give everybody a chance to shake their heads out and and take this. So I'm gonna turn your volume down here, Ancel, and I'll turn you back up when we come back in.
Okay.
So okay, so we're going to take our 6-minute break, and then we will return, and we will find out what else the rabbis have to say about this. Stay tuned.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
Delicious things to eat.
The popcorn can't be beat. The sparkling drinks are just dandy. The chocolate bars and the candy. So let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
It's intermission time, folks, so hurry, hurry, hurry. Step right over to our refreshment center for the most extravagant array of refreshment goodies ever assembled under one roof. Enjoy breathtaking, mouth-watering goodies, everything from a snack to a delicious full meal. At our refreshment center, you'll find a large variety of goodies to satisfy your hunger, your thirst, or your sweet tooth. So hurry, hurry, hurry. Visit our refreshment center now. The show starts in 5 minutes. The show starts in 4 minutes. The show starts in 3 minutes. The show starts in 2 minutes. The show starts in 1 minute. And now, on with the show.
And we are back now that I found my microphone button. Okay, so let me know in the chat room, are you finding this interesting at all? So, during the break, Rabbi Ancel and I were discussing this, and we said, number one, the first thing that we have to understand that according to Jewish law and according to Torah law, whatever conclusion that this Beit Din comes up with is not valid, because the Torah and the Halakha tells us that a judge or judges cannot hear testimony from one party when the other party is not present.
That goes even further, especially, God forbid, if there's ever a get, a divorce. A bet din cannot listen to a husband if the wife is not present, or cannot listen to a wife if the husband is not present. If they do, and that bet din issues a get, a divorce, it is not valid. And that person may think it is valid, and then 5 years later find out that they're still married to each other.
Yeah.
So halacha has safeguards, and this is why it states clearly that both parties must be present. If one
That's
party
right.
is there, the beit din is not even allowed to speak to them.
That is right.
It is against Jewish law.
Yeah. So we have to understand that this is what we're reading here is basically an exercise in halakhic decisions. It's not an actual decision, because the decision would not be valid because the other person is not present. Okay. So let's go on. So we have Marshall says very much so. Donald says very interesting, and Richard says I concur. So evidently we have just as big of nerds as us in the chat room. So okay, so let's go on. So
You can,
yes,
yeah, just before we go on, you can look at the entire Jewish law from the Shulchan Aruch, and you will see that this rabbi has a discussion with this rabbi, and they come to a conclusion. But that is wrong because most of the time it's my conclusion, it's Aryel's conclusion, it's this. It doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it wrong, but it leaves it open to discussion.
That's
And this
right.
is the nice part about halacha and the Torah, that we can sit and discuss that. Is it right? It is it wrong? And this is how I learn, Aryel learns, and the people in the chat room, everybody learns.
Yeah,
And
it's
this is why Kate.
yeah, it's interesting because when we look at the Talmud and the Gemara and the Mishnah and the Halakha, the Shulchan Aruch, that basically what we find is the discussions are there, and very rarely do we actually find that a final conclusion is drawn. Now, there are some cases where they come to a compromise, such as how do we affix a mezuzah on the door? Should it be horizontal or should it be vertical? Well, they said, well, we can't really make the decision because both parties actually present very, very cogent dissertations on this. So what we'll do is we'll compromise between the two and we'll put it at a 45-degree angle. Now, some Sephardim actually do still put them upright and so on, but there's nothing wrong with that because there is no final conclusion in the law. Same thing, we've got Hanukkah coming up, and there was a big debate between Hillel and Shammai about do we start with 8 and reduce and go to 1, or do we start with 1 and increase and go to 8?
Or do we go from the left or do we go from the right?
The left or the right, yeah. So what they did is they came up and said, okay, well, at this point, that the arguments are both valid for doing one or the other. They're both valid. But for now, what we'll do is we'll do it this way. We'll increase until Mashiach comes and tells us which way is the correct way. That's the great thing about, as Ancel was pointing out, this is the great thing about Jewish law is that we get an idea of what we should do, but we know that there is pretty much almost always a dissenting opinion, which is just as valid as the majority opinion. Now, in most cases in Halakha, we typically go with the majority opinion. But there are cases where we don't go with the majority opinion. We have to go with the minority opinion. And this always leaves, as Rabbi Ancel said, this leaves it open for continued scholarship. We still continue to study it because we're not that smart. Let's just face it. We're
when
not
Moshiach
that
is going to
smart.
come, we'll get the right answer.
We'll get the right answer then. Okay, so let's continue on with here. So, an application of this case, this is going back to the seats. The application of this case is one who purchased a sefer and wrote his name and or notes in the sefer and later discovered that the sefer was missing a few pages. The Pirkei Hoshen, chapter 13, footnote 28, rules that the customer may nonetheless return the sefer since the sale is a mekach ta'ut. He is still entitled to a full refund even though by writing his name in the sefer, he prevented the sefer from fixing the sefer and selling it to another customer at a discount. Similarly, the Shulchan Aruch, as previously stated, Ibid, rules that if someone buys an object and requests delivery of the object to his home, and he later discovers that the object was imperfect, and thus the sale is invalid because of mekach ta'ut, the seller must pay the cost of shipping the object back. The reason the seller cannot claim that the added expense is due to the customer's transporting it to his home and thus is not his responsibility is because the customer acted with the seller's permission in transporting it. Similarly, in your situation, since you had the neighbor's express permission to drink what was actually his wine, you are not liable for damaging his wine by consuming it.
Did he have permission? The seller never said.
Well, yeah.
It doesn't say the seller never said to him, "Go ahead and have a good time." He just lent him a bottle. He could have said, "Listen,
well, according
you
to
could put the
this,
bottle on your shelf and look at it."
According to this, he borrowed the wine to make Kiddush Shabbat.
Okay. This is what the borrower said, but not the seller.
Again, that goes back to why these things that they were reading are not actually valid decisions.
Correct.
Okay. So we should note that this reasoning is true even if your neighbor was unaware that he lent you very expensive wine. We see in the Gemara, Bava Metzia 42b, that the concept of mekak tuot applies even to if the seller himself was unaware of the imperfection. So
Question.
that goes right back to the seeds, right?
I have a question now.
Uh-huh.
So they're telling me that the seller was not aware. He's the one who bought the wine. He should know that. The seller knows what kind of wine he drinks.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're talking about the person he borrowed the wine from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the seller knows he's the one he's been buying.
Well, remember, it's not a sale.
There's too many things happening with this transaction. Is that the seller? You went to the store. You knew exactly how much you paid for those bottles. So when you gave me the bottle of wine, you knew exactly what you're giving me.
Yeah.
So their conclusion is wrong.
Well, let's find out.
Okay.
The concept of mekak tuot has nothing to do with blame. It is simply, as we wrote earlier, the result of lack of desire and consent for the transaction to take place. Even though you do not have to pay for the damage you did to the wine, you do have to pay for the benefit you had from it. In the case of very expensive wine, the benefit is much less than the damage. This is similar to what the Gemara, Bava Kama, Folio 28, writes in the case an ox eats someone else's expensive food that was sitting in the public thoroughfare. Even though the ox's owner does not have to pay for damages his ox caused, he does have to pay for the benefit he had from the food in not having to feed his ox cheap ox food.
Why?
Similarly, we find this concept in the case of the orphans. I was waiting to get to this one. The case of the orphans who, after they slaughtered a cow, which they saw among their inherited possessions, and ate its meat, found out that the cow really belonged to another person. The Gemara, Ketubot 34a, or 34b, rules that the orphans don't have to pay for the full damages since they were reasonably unaware that it belonged to someone else. However,
okay, question. You see,
well, let me finish. Okay. So they're unaware that it belonged to someone else. However, they still must pay for the benefit they derived from eating the meat. Okay, so now, your question.
You have to be careful. They have to be careful when they talk about this case, is they say that the twins, they would reason. What is the definition of reasonably?
What somebody of normal, how does it go? Somebody of normal understanding would think. It's basically allowing for an assumption.
There's the problem now.
Yeah.
This is what I was coming to it again. That's an assumption. That's wrong.
Well, hang on. Now, these orphans got their inherited property. They assumed that that property was now theirs. They didn't realize that their father had borrowed this ox from somebody else. They just assumed that it was
their
theirs.
problem. Unfortunately, that's their problem.
Well, it says that they don't have to pay for the damage, but they do have to pay for the benefit.
What? Okay, I'll agree with that.
Okay.
But their assumption is wrong.
Well, how is their assumption wrong? I mean, if the parent died and they inherit his property, and this is among the property, I mean, what are they supposed to do? Go and find out if he borrowed anything from anybody before they use it, or? I think it's reasonable. It's a reasonable assumption for somebody to say, well, this is my father's property, therefore I inherited his property, therefore it belongs to me.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Oh, okay. So they find out later on that it didn't belong to them, then therefore they don't have to pay for the damage, but they do have to pay for the benefit.
Okay.
Okay. And then, actually, if you go to the Gemara, Ketubot 34b, and read the case, it's actually quite a bit longer. Because it actually talks about, it talks about their reasonable assumption. It talks about how much they would have to pay for the benefit, because there was a difference between, would they have eaten the meat if they knew it was an expensive cow or ox? Or have they, would they have chosen to eat a less expensive meat, and so on. It's actually quite a bit longer. So anyway,
wouldn't the father have told them? I said, listen, I'm leaving in the inheritance. I'm leaving you, let's say, 20 cows and so and so and so and so. I mean, they're not obligated to go ahead and count the cows or whatever. You can.
Well, again, we don't know what the circumstances were. I mean, the guy borrows the cow and he's walking back into the house, and he trips and he falls into a hole and breaks his neck. And he never has a chance to say anything.
So that's why I've been saying all night. You need to see the whole thing.
Exactly.
You need to read the whole case.
Exactly. So Simcha puts in
that's
here.
The problem. By not reading the whole case, you argue definitely. I am 100% sure you're going to make the wrong assumption or conclusion.
Right. But if we were hearing both sides and we found out that what the person here is stating is actually correct, we would know how they drew that conclusion.
Okay.
So the exercise is actually still valid.
Correct.
Which is what we talked about this summer.
Exactly.
So let's see. Simcha says that did the lender offer one of his least expensive bottles of wine for the loan? If so, he may not realize that it would prove difficult for the borrower to replace it.
The whole thing is if this guy gives me a bottle of wine, and listen, for this guy to have a bottle of wine that's $200, he must buy expensive wines. So there's no excuse. He knew exactly what the bottle of wine was worth. Mm-hmm. My thing is, he should have told him. He says, listen, I don't mind giving it to you for Shabbos. Enjoy it. But that bottle is $200. I probably would have dropped, that bottle would have dropped out of my hand.
And then we'd have the whole case of what happens when you damage. We talked about that case during the summer. The person who damages the bottle of wine by accident.
You touch it, you pay for it. You touch it, you break it, you pay for it. That doesn't hold anywhere. There is no such law. People think there is that is a law. That doesn't hold.
That's right.
There's no such law. But people put it out there. You touch it, it falls, you break it. It's the same thing. You go into a liquor store, and you're looking through the racks of bottles of wine. Well, you know the bottles of wine are put on an angle so they don't go sour. And you walk by, and a bottle of wine falls out. Whose fault is it?
Yeah, well, remember we had that case this summer that we talked about where the guy pulls out the bottle of wine from the case and breaks
Correct.
breaks two bottles because they were packed so tightly.
Yeah, he didn't intentionally break it.
Yeah.
But
We had a long discussion on that one.
like I said, these discussions we can go on all 2 weeks, 3 weeks, because there'll always be another question.
That's right.
And like I said, we're talking about two people, but we can also now get into a third party. We can also go to the third party could have bought it from the manufacturer. So now you have four people. So
right.
Who's at fault? So these are all the things that we can learn. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we are going to come up with the right conclusion, but we learn some of the things that can happen when two people go in front of a bed din and they say, this is what happened. But they both have to be there and both have to be listened to.
Yeah. So what we find here is, in conclusion, based on this Beit Din here, in conclusion, you do not have to return a bottle of the expensive wine that you drank, but you do have to pay for the benefit you derived from the wine. In the coming article, which is part 2 of this, we will, as a Hashem, determine how much money that is in your case. How much money do you have to pay for the benefit that you derived?
Okay, so you derived the benefit. Listen, you got a bottle of wine in honor of Shabbat. Yeah, you enjoyed the bottle of wine, but it says from the beginning the guy doesn't like wine. Doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean that he really derived the benefit.
Well, that's when he did benefit from it in the fact that he was able to make the Kiddush Shabbat.
Yep, doesn't mean he enjoyed it.
No, that's right, and that's where the second part of this comes in to determine, okay, what benefit did you derive from this? How much do you have to pay? Because you don't normally drink wine, and you definitely wouldn't have drank wine that was that expensive.
So who's going to decide?
Well, that's in the second part.
Okay. I want the people in the chat room to understand that the question sounds simple, but it can get so twisted, and not the wrong way. It gets, because you will have from one comment you will have 10 questions, And the worst thing about that, when you learn halacha or Torah or Mishnah or the Talmud, is to never assume, because if you assume, you will never learn, because you will assume most of the time the wrong way, because to learn it, you must start from the beginning of the case and go down to the end of the case and read it 2 or 3 times until it sinks in, to understand what went through. And then you can make up your mind, whether right or wrong. You're allowed to make up your mind. You as an individual, as a Jew, you're allowed to say, this is what I believe, not this is what I assume. I believe that, yes, he should replace the bottle of wine for this and this reason. Doesn't mean you're right. It doesn't mean you're wrong. But you understood the reason why. And that's very important. This is why I enjoy these things with Aryel, because we can agree and sometimes to disagree. And still doesn't mean that I'm right and he's wrong, or vice versa. And we can come to an agreement and say, listen, we believe that this would be the right way to do it. And that's the way it should be done between all people, whether it has to do with life, whether it has to do with marriage, whether it has to do with food, a good bottle of wine, transactions, sales. This is everything about life revolves around decisions that you have to make. And sometimes we are human. Human is to err. Sometimes we make the wrong decisions.
That's true. That is very true. Now, that's a very good point. And that why do we spend so much time delving into this like this? And we have, when we go back to the parsha where we read about Sodom and Gomorrah, a lot of information about how judges are supposed to act are derived from that parsha. Because when God says to Abraham, he says that, the cry of Sodom is come to me, come before me. So he goes down to investigate. He says, I am going to go down there and see if it's true. Now, God already knew, but he had to perform as a judge would perform, because he set the rules. And he has to abide by the rules that he's set. And he's also setting an example for the rest of us that don't make a decision based on what you hear. Go and investigate for yourself.
This is why I am careful, Aryel is careful, because if we ordain rabbis, and we don't ordain too many, and to issue somebody a yore, which is a simple, you can be a puppet rabbi, but when you give somebody the designation of yore, yadin to judge, that befalls a big responsibility on that rabbi, because there's many sections in the Talmud and the Shulchan Aruch what a judge is allowed to do, and very little, and what he's not allowed. There's a lot of writing what he's not allowed to do, and you have to be careful.
Well, when you look at the 613 mitzvot,
yep,
and we look at how many of those mitzvot are directly related to a judge. There is 58 of them that are directly related. This is just from the Torah. 58 of them that are directly related to a judge and how a judge must conduct himself.
Because also, being a judge, you're allowed to judge, but basically, that judge is responsible to the biggest judge, and that is God.
Yeah.
So,
well, that too. There's that. That's why nobody judges alone. Nobody can pass a judgment by themselves. There has to be at least three. And as we read in Rashi's commentary 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, that in a case of a capital case, it's 23 judges, and if they can't reach a decision, it may go all the way to 70 judges.
72.
72?
72 judges. And what happens if they disagree? Who do they go to?
Well, I think at that point it becomes a in a capital case where it's such as a murder, I think if they can't come to a decision after they get to 72 judges, then wouldn't that be they would have to go to a city of refuge until the death of the Kohen Gadol?
Correct. They have to go to the Kohen Gadol. But here's the whole thing. When a Jew is adjudged a capital case and he is given the death sentence, the death sentence is only on paper. It is a Jew cannot execute another Jew. So the only person in Israel that was ever executed was Eichmann, the Nazi. But even a Palestinian that murders, he goes to jail for life. He doesn't get executed. We are not allowed. Thou shalt not kill. Although it doesn't mean thou shalt not kill, because the translation really means thou shalt not murder.
Right, right.
You understand?
Yep.
But in Israel, if somebody is given the death sentence, it's only on paper, never ever executed. So a capital case is not as tough as it is. It's tougher to decide about the two seeds.
Yeah.
It is, because, like I said, if we're going to go through capital punishment, then we're breaking one of the Ten Commandments. So, no capital punishment in Israel. It's what it is. That's one of the Ten Commandments. And an Arab will kill a Jew, and he'll go for life. There's no death penalty.
Okay, well, listen, I'm going to mute you for the moment, and then we're going to sign off, and then I'll get back with you here in a minute. So it's nice having this kind of power. And just turn his volume off. You can't hear him. I can't hear him. I can say anything I want now. Not that I would. But, okay, I want to thank you all for being here. I hope that you're actually finding this interesting. Next week, we will actually go into what this Beit Din actually determined was, what does that person actually have to pay for the benefit that he actually derived from this wine. And tomorrow night, Torah study in depth with yours truly, and we'll pick up where we left off with where we finished Mishpatim. We're going to finish up the Midrash for Mishpatim, and then Friday night at 8 p.m. is Kavlat and Ma'ariv, the Shabbat service, and then Shabbat morning at 10 a.m. is Shachrit and Musaf, and don't forget, what is it, Hanukkah starts on Sunday? Sunday night, first light. So Hag Sameach in advance, and I hope you're ready for that. I hope you'll be return with us to be with us next week again for Zeta's Story Corner at 8 o'clock on Monday, and right back here again on Tuesday for the Rabbis Discuss, when we'll go into part 2 of this whole thing. So until then, everybody, we'll simply say, Laila Tov.